The disguise. CEO Malik Anderson stared out of his towering office window, his gaze sweeping over the city skyline. The usual sense of satisfaction that came with the view was absent today, replaced by a knot of anxiety in his chest. In his hand, he clutched a thick report, an employee satisfaction survey that painted a grim picture of his company's internal culture. Complaints of favoritism, lack of upward mobility, and toxic management practices had surged. What hit him hardest were the growing whispers of racial discrimination within his company. This was his company, his vision, and it was spiraling out of control. TechGrid, the company Malik had built from the ground up, was once a symbol of innovation and opportunity. Yet now, after years of expansion and record profits, the cracks were beginning to show. Productivity was slipping, and employee satisfaction had plummeted. If Malik didn't act fast, the company he'd worked tirelessly to create might crumble beneath its own weight. He had always believed in a hands-on approach, but as the company grew, he had been forced to delegate more and more. Somewhere along the line, he had lost touch with what was happening on the ground. Malik's thoughts raced as he mulled over the next step. The standard solution would be to hire consultants, organize focus groups, or demand reports from his management team. But deep down, he knew those wouldn't give him the real picture. That's when the idea struck him. What if he went undercover? Not as a manager or supervisor, but as an entry-level employee, the kind of worker whose voice often went unheard. It was a risky plan, but Malik was no stranger to taking risks. He knew that blending into his own company would give him an unfiltered look into the daily lives of his employees. He'd see firsthand how they were treated, what their struggles were, and where the culture had gone wrong. More importantly, he'd be able to experience what it felt like to be at the bottom of the company ladder. A few days later, the plan was set into motion. Malik's trusted assistant, Rachel, arranged everything with the utmost discretion. Only she knew about the plan, and even she had her reservations. "Are you sure about this, Malik?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "If anyone recognizes you, it could blow up in our faces. People might see it as a PR stunt, or worse, lose trust in the leadership." But Malik was resolute. "It's the only way to get the truth. I need to see it for myself. I've been too disconnected for too long." The transformation was drastic. Malik traded in his expensive tailored suits and designer shoes for the standard uniform worn by the company's front desk staff. His usually clean-shaven face was now adorned with a well-placed fake mustache, and his signature glasses were swapped out for a more understated pair. The final touch was a slight change in his hairstyle, making him nearly unrecognizable to those who knew him. Rachel couldn't help but laugh when she saw the finished look. "You look like you're ready to star in a spy movie," she teased. Malik chuckled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "Let's hope my acting skills are up to the task." With a deep breath, Malik left his penthouse office for the front desk on the ground floor of his own company. Walking through the halls as an anonymous receptionist felt surreal. Colleagues he had worked with for years passed by without so much as a glance in his direction. It was as if he had vanished from the world he had built. His first day as Mike, the new temp receptionist, started off uneventfully. He greeted visitors, answered phone calls, and directed people to their appointments. But as the hours passed, Malik began to notice something troubling. The front desk was treated as an afterthought, an invisible cog in the company machine. Employees breezed past him without acknowledging his presence, and a few managers seemed downright dismissive, barely looking at him as they barked orders. One incident stood out in particular. A senior executive, Diane, approached the desk with a scowl on her face. She had a reputation as a no-nonsense leader, but the way she treated Malik made his blood boil. "Can you not mess up the scheduling like the last guy?" she snapped. "We don't have time for incompetence down here." Without waiting for a response, she strode off, leaving Malik stunned. It wasn't just the disrespect that stung. It was the realization that this was how many of his employees must be treated daily. No one should feel like they're less valuable because of their role, and yet here he was, experiencing it firsthand. During a lunch break, Malik overheard two mid-level managers chatting by the coffee machine. They didn't realize the receptionist was within earshot. "I swear, this place is a sinking ship," one of them muttered. "Upper management doesn't care about us, and HR is a joke. It's all about who you know, not what you do." The other manager sighed in agreement. "Yeah, and don't get me started on the diversity push. They act like they care, but it's all for show. They'd promote the same people every time." Malik's heart sank. He had always prided himself on creating a diverse and inclusive company, but hearing these complaints made him question whether those values had been maintained as TechGrid grew. Were the right people being promoted, or was favoritism corrupting the system? Later that afternoon, Malik had his first encounter with Doris, a receptionist who had been with the company for over a decade. She was sharp, efficient, and carried a quiet strength that reminded Malik of his own mother. "New guy, huh?" she said, raising an eyebrow as she handed Malik a stack of visitor badges. "Yeah, just started," Malik replied, careful to keep his voice neutral. "Well, keep your head down and don't cause any trouble. They don't pay us enough to deal with all the nonsense that comes with this job," Doris said with a wry smile. Despite her casual tone, there was a sadness in her eyes. It was clear that Doris had seen her fair share of mistreatment over the years. Malik wanted to ask her more about her experiences, but he knew he had to tread carefully. For now, he would observe and listen. By the end of the day, Malik's mind was racing with everything he had witnessed. The culture he had hoped to foster was crumbling, and the people he trusted to lead were failing his employees. He knew that his journey as a receptionist was just beginning, but already he could feel the weight of what lay ahead. That night, as Malik removed his disguise and looked at himself in the mirror, he felt a mix of anger, shame, and determination. This was only the first step, but it was enough to know that the company needed a major overhaul, starting with the people in charge. Malik was ready to dig deeper, to uncover every hidden flaw, and to rebuild his company from the ground up. This was no longer just about saving TechGrid. It was about restoring his own integrity as a leader. Tomorrow, he would return to the front desk with a sharper focus. He had seen the cracks, and now it was time to fix them. The hidden cracks. The next morning, Malik stood in front of the mirror, once again adjusting his disguise. His mind was still reeling from the revelations of the previous day. The view from the top had never shown him the cracks he now saw up close, and he had a gnawing feeling that there was much more to uncover. For all his years running TechGrid, he had never felt so distant from the realities of its workforce. As he finished getting into character, Mike the receptionist emerged once again, ready to dive deeper into the undercurrents running through his company. By the time he arrived at the front desk, Doris was already there, her expression as unreadable as ever. Malik greeted her with a nod, not wanting to draw attention to himself. They worked in relative silence for most of the morning, but he could sense that Doris, with her years of experience, was sizing him up. "Don't get too comfortable," she said abruptly, breaking the silence as she stacked a few folders on her desk. "They go through temps here faster than they go through office coffee." Malik turned to her, feigning casual curiosity. "Why is that? Seems like a steady job." Doris gave him a look, as though gauging whether to let him in on the office's unspoken truths. "Management doesn't value this position, or any of the low-level jobs for that matter. They think we're disposable. It's why people don't stay long. You're either invisible or treated like dirt. And if you speak up, you're out." Her words confirmed what Malik had feared, but hearing them said so plainly hit harder than he expected. The idea that people were treated as expendable was far from the culture of respect and inclusivity he had envisioned for TechGrid. If the people at the foundation of his company felt this way, what kind of rot had spread to the higher ranks? As the day progressed, Malik found himself observing more than just the interactions at the front desk. He watched how different departments treated their employees, how managers communicated, or more often, failed to communicate, with their teams and how workers went about their daily tasks. There was a clear divide between the higher-ups and everyone else. Those in managerial positions rarely mingled with the staff. In fact, they seemed to treat them as little more than tools for completing tasks. Around noon, Malik encountered a small but telling incident. The junior IT technician named Ben approached the front desk, looking flustered and clearly stressed. He was lugging a pile of laptops, likely for repair or updates, and was clearly struggling to balance them all. "Excuse me," Ben said, trying to catch Doris's attention while fumbling with the laptops. "I need a meeting room to set these up. All the usual spots are booked." Doris didn't even glance up from her screen. "I don't handle that. You'll have to ask your supervisor," she said, her voice flat and disinterested. Ben sighed in frustration. "I've been trying, but he's in a meeting and won't respond. I just need a room for an hour." Before Malik could step in, a manager from HR, Paul, walked by. Paul paused, looking at Ben like he was little more than a nuisance. "Why are you bothering the receptionists? They're not here to solve your problems," Paul snapped. Ben bristled, but he kept his voice low. "I just need a room. I've been trying to get an answer for." "Then try harder," Paul interrupted dismissively before walking away. Malik's blood boiled. He had watched the entire exchange unfold, feeling every ounce of Ben's frustration and humiliation. This wasn't just a one-off moment of rudeness. It was a pattern Malik had seen play out across departments all day. The lack of respect, the disregard for basic communication, it was a systemic problem. When Ben walked away, visibly deflated, Malik couldn't stay silent any longer. He caught up with him near the break room. "Hey," Malik called out, trying to sound casual. "I saw what just happened. That wasn't right." Ben glanced at Malik, a mix of confusion and appreciation in his eyes. "It's fine," he muttered. "Just another day at TechGrid." "It shouldn't be like that, though," Malik replied. "Have you thought about raising these kinds of issues with HR or anyone higher up?" Ben let out a bitter laugh. "You're new, right? You'll learn soon enough. HR is a joke. They're not here for us. If you're not management, they don't care." Malik's stomach turned at the harsh reality of Ben's words. HR was supposed to be the backbone of employee support, a place where grievances could be addressed and solutions could be found. Instead, it had become a bureaucratic arm of management, more interested in covering up problems than solving them. The disillusionment on Ben's face was undeniable, and Malik knew it reflected the feelings of many. The day wore on, and Malik began to see even more of the company's hidden dysfunctions. In the cafeteria, he overheard whispered conversations about underpaid workers in tech support and customer service. One woman complained about being passed over for promotions multiple times despite her qualifications, while another spoke of burnout and unrealistic deadlines that her supervisor ignored. But what struck Malik most was the apathy. It wasn't just that people were unhappy, it was that they had given up hope of anything changing. They had accepted the toxic culture as an unchangeable reality. The vibrant energy that had once fueled TechGrid's rise had been drained from its core, leaving behind a shell of corporate indifference. By the time his shift ended, Malik felt more exhausted than he had in years. The weight of what he had uncovered in just 2 days pressed heavily on him. As he returned to his penthouse office, shedding his disguise once again, he stared out at the same city skyline he had admired for years, only now it felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen from the ideals he once held. That night, Malik couldn't sleep. His thoughts raced, replaying the countless moments of disrespect, disengagement, and outright mistreatment he had witnessed. He thought of Doris, a veteran of the company who had long since given up on fighting the system. He thought of Ben, trying to do his job despite the brick walls put up by uncaring managers. And he thought of Paul, the HR manager who embodied everything wrong with TechGrid's leadership. The next morning, he called Rachel into his office, his face set in determination. "We need to talk," he said, handing her a detailed list of observations he had made. "We have a serious problem, and it starts with leadership." Rachel took the list and scanned it, her face growing grim as she read. "It's worse than I thought," she said softly. Malik nodded. "Much worse. I've only scratched the surface, but we need to start taking action. This isn't just about policy changes or PR stunts. We need to rebuild from the inside out." Rachel looked at him, concern etched across her face. "Are you sure about this? Once you start making changes, people are going to push back, especially those who've benefited from the way things are." Malik's jaw tightened. "Let them push. This is my company, and I'm not going to let it fall apart. If people don't like the changes, they can leave. But I'll be damned if I stand by and watch TechGrid rot from the inside." As Malik began planning the next phase of his undercover mission, he knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but he was ready. The company he had built was worth fighting for. And so were the people who had been silenced for far too long. With renewed purpose, Malik prepared himself for the next steps. He would dig deeper, confront those responsible, and dismantle the toxic structures that had taken root in his company. The cracks had been revealed, and now it was time to start fixing them, no matter what it took. Unmasking the true face of TechGrid, Malik returned to his office with an intensity that startled even himself. He hadn't anticipated how deep the rot went, or how insulated he had become from the day-to-day operations. The view from his corner office had turned into an illusion, a high perch that shielded him from the reality on the ground. But now that he had seen the cracks in the foundation, there was no turning back. He spent the weekend in deep thought, poring over every detail, every observation he had made during his undercover days. The casual disrespect, the toxic hierarchies, the broken communication channels. Everything was worse than he had imagined. And now, the question loomed large. How do you fix a machine while it's still running? How do you uproot a problem that has become so deeply embedded without causing the entire company to crumble? On Monday morning, Malik strode into his office, purpose in his step. He called a meeting with his top executives and senior managers, including Rachel. As they gathered around the sleek glass conference table, the tension was palpable. Some had sensed that something was coming. Malik had been quieter than usual, observing more, and the unease was starting to trickle through the ranks. Rachel sat to his right, her eyes scanning the room, gauging the mood of the other executives. She knew what was coming, and she knew this meeting would set the tone for the turbulent days ahead. When everyone had taken their seats, Malik rose from his chair. His gaze swept over the faces of the people who had helped him build TechGrid into a powerhouse, some of whom had clearly lost their way. "Good morning," Malik began, his voice steady but firm. "We have a problem." The room fell silent. Executives exchanged nervous glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Malik rarely addressed the company's internal issues directly, and when he did, it usually meant significant changes were on the horizon. "I spent last week going undercover as a temp," Malik continued, ignoring the raised eyebrows and shocked murmurs. "I've seen firsthand what's happening at the ground level, and what I've seen is unacceptable." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This company has lost its way. We've built something extraordinary, but somewhere along the line, we let things slide. We've allowed a culture to develop where people feel disrespected, disposable, and unheard. That ends today." The room was stunned into silence. Malik's words hung heavy in the air. He could see the shifting expressions, the flickers of fear, guilt, and defensiveness. Some of the senior managers had thrived in the current system, benefiting from the hierarchies and unchecked power. They knew that their positions, their way of operating, were about to be threatened. One executive, Mark from operations, spoke up, his tone cautious. "Malik, we've faced some challenges, yes. But you know as well as I do that with a company this size, it's inevitable that some things slip through the cracks. We've been focusing on growth, on expanding our reach." Malik cut him off sharply. Growth means nothing if the foundation is crumbling. I won't let this company's success come at the expense of our people. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but fell silent. Malik continued, "We're going to rebuild, and it's going to be painful. We're going to look at every department, every team, every leadership position. If you're part of the problem, you will be replaced. If you're not willing to change, you will be replaced. And if you think you can stand in the way of this transformation, let me assure you, you can't." Malik's eyes scanned the room, locking onto the faces of those he suspected had been complicit in the toxic culture. He wasn't here to mince words or entertain excuses. TechGrid was his creation, and he wasn't about to let it rot from within because a few managers prioritized their egos over the company's core values. For too long, he continued, we've allowed a culture of silence to grow. Employees don't feel safe speaking up. HR has become a rubber stamp for management, instead of a resource for the people who make this company run. That changes today. Rachel, who had remained silent up until this point, spoke now, her voice calm but firm. We're implementing a new system for employee feedback, one that bypasses traditional chains of command. It will be anonymous, and it will be reviewed directly by me and Malik. No more bottlenecks, no more managers sweeping problems under the rug. Some of the managers looked alarmed, particularly those who had built their careers by manipulating the internal structures to their advantage. Malik noticed the flicker of discomfort in Paul's expression. Paul had been the head of HR for years, and Malik was certain that he had either willfully ignored the complaints of lower-level employees or actively suppressed them. Before anyone could voice their objections, Malik added, "There will also be leadership training, mandatory for all managers. I want everyone in this room to understand what it means to lead with integrity, empathy, and respect. And if you're not willing to commit to that, there's no place for you here." A heavy silence followed his words. Malik could feel the resistance building, but he wasn't afraid of it. Change always brought resistance, especially from those who had the most to lose. "I'll be meeting with each of you individually over the next week," Malik said, his tone final. "We'll be reviewing your departments, your teams, and your approach to leadership. I'm giving you the chance to make things right, to be part of the solution. But make no mistake, this is a zero-tolerance situation. You're either in or you're out." With that, Malik ended the meeting, leaving the room in stunned silence. He knew the coming weeks would be filled with friction, with pushback from those who thrived in the current system. But Malik had seen enough. He was done with the complacency, with the excuses. The time for half measures had passed. Over the next few days, Malik followed through on his promise. He met with every executive, scrutinizing their teams, their leadership styles, and their willingness to adapt to the new era of TechGrid. Some embraced the change, seeing it as an opportunity to right past wrongs. Others resisted, their fear and self-preservation instincts kicking in. But Malik was unwavering. He fired Paul from HR within the first week. It was a symbolic and strategic move, a message to the rest of the company that he wasn't playing games. Paul had been a gatekeeper, someone who had enabled the toxic culture by turning a blind eye to the concerns of employees. His departure sent shockwaves through the company, but it also gave Malik a sense of progress. The first crack in the old guard had been made. In Paul's place, Malik brought in a new head of HR, someone from outside the company, with a reputation for transforming corporate cultures. Sarah Patel was a no-nonsense, results-driven leader, known for holding companies accountable for how they treated their employees. Malik had sought her out specifically for this role, and he trusted her to help lead the internal revolution TechGrid desperately needed. Within a month, the shift was palpable. Malik could feel the tension in the air, but he could also sense the slow, steady return of something that had been missing for a long time: hope. Employees began to speak up more in the anonymous feedback system, their voices finally being heard. Sarah led the charge in restructuring HR, ensuring that every complaint was investigated and that employees felt safe bringing their issues forward. The road ahead was still long, and Malik knew that the hardest battles were yet to come. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that had been clouded by the company's rapid growth and success. This wasn't just about saving TechGrid, it was about rebuilding it into something better, something that reflected the values Malik had held from the very beginning. As he stood in his office one evening, looking out over the city skyline, Malik allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The journey had only just begun, but for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly where he was going. And this time, he wouldn't be walking the path alone. The calm before the storm. The initial tremors of change shook TechGrid to its core, but as the dust settled, Malik realized the true battle was just beginning. While many employees welcomed the reforms, pockets of resistance remained, festering like old wounds. Some of the middle managers and executives who had grown comfortable in the old regime were still clinging to their ways, hoping the storm would pass. They underestimated Malik's resolve. A week after Sarah Patel joined as the new head of HR, Malik called her to his office. The city glowed beneath them, the skyline stretching endlessly toward the horizon. But Malik's focus was entirely inward, weighing the obstacles ahead. "How's the feedback system working out?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Sarah smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's working, too well, in some ways. The floodgates have opened. We're seeing patterns in certain departments, consistent complaints about toxic managers, ignored harassment, discrimination, overwork. Some of the names aren't surprising, and some are concerning." Malik nodded, his face hardening. "Who's at the top of the list?" Sarah hesitated, tapping her tablet before she answered. "Mainly middle management, but there are some big names from the executive level as well. Laura in finance, Jason in marketing. Their teams have the highest turnover, and the complaints about them are consistent. Intimidation, bullying, shutting down any form of dissent." And she added, with a look of concern, "They have allies, senior allies." "Laura and Jason," Malik murmured, familiar with their work but less with their interpersonal dynamics. His company had grown so fast, he realized that some of the worst offenders had thrived under his radar. And it wasn't just about incompetence, it was willful sabotage of the culture he was trying to rebuild. "We can't clean this up piecemeal," Sarah said, her tone cautious but insistent. "There's a lot of rot. The bad actors are too entrenched, and they're trying to undermine everything we're doing. It's not just about firing people, it's about replacing the power structures they've built around themselves. If we don't do this carefully, it could backfire." Malik knew she was right. It wasn't enough to just remove the problem people. If the systems that protected and rewarded them remained in place, new bullies would just rise to fill the vacuum. The changes had to be deep, systematic, and absolute. "I want to meet with Jason and Laura," Malik said finally. "Face to face. No intermediaries. I want to hear from them directly." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You're giving them a chance to explain." "No," Malik said, his voice cold. "I'm giving them a chance to walk away." The following day, Malik summoned Laura and Jason to his office separately. Laura arrived first, her heels clicking on the polished floor with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. She was dressed impeccably, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek bun, and her sharp eyes betrayed no sign of concern. "Malik," she said smoothly, sliding into the chair opposite his desk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Malik didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've been reviewing the feedback from your department, Laura. There are serious concerns." Her expression didn't falter. "Concerns? I'm aware of a few grumblings, but that's to be expected. You know how it is in finance. Tight deadlines, high pressure. Some people just aren't cut out for it." "Grumblings?" Malik leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "I've heard accusations of bullying, harassment, even gaslighting. People aren't just unhappy, they're afraid of you." Laura's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before her mask of composure slipped back into place. "Malik, you know how these things can get exaggerated. I run a tight ship because that's what's expected." If people can't handle the pressure, maybe they're in the wrong company. Don't patronize me, Laura, Malik said, his tone icy. We're not talking about people not handling pressure. We're talking about people being systematically broken down under your leadership. I'm giving you a chance to resign. You can leave with some dignity, or you can stay and force me to tear your reputation apart in the process. For the first time, Laura's expression shifted to something close to anger. You think you can just replace me? Do you have any idea what I've done for this company? How much I've sacrificed? Malik didn't flinch. I know exactly what you've done. And now it's time for you to go. Silence stretched between them for a moment, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Laura's nostrils flared, but she knew she had lost. Without another word, she rose from her chair and walked out, her head held high. But her departure marked a significant crack in the foundation of resistance Malik was dismantling. Jason, on the other hand, was less composed. When he arrived, there was an edge of defiance in his posture, but his eyes betrayed a simmering panic. He knew the walls were closing in. Malik, he began, but Malik didn't let him finish. You've got two options, Malik said, cutting him off sharply. Resign quietly, or I'll fire you publicly. And if I fire you, I'll make sure everyone knows why. Jason blustered, launching into a defensive tirade about his performance, the demands of marketing, the stress of managing a team that just didn't get it. Malik let him go on for a minute, watching as Jason's thin veneer of control cracked. He had seen this type of manager before, the kind that thrived on fear, who mistook intimidation for leadership. Enough, Malik said, his voice like a knife. I'm not interested in your excuses. I'm not interested in salvaging your ego. The damage you've done to this company, to your team, ends today. You're out. Jason's face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing as he grasped for some final retort, but nothing came. He stood up, his fists clenched at his sides, and stormed out of Malik's office without another word. By the end of the week, 2 more senior managers had resigned, and Malik had personally fired 3 others. Word spread through TechGrid like wildfire. Malik wasn't bluffing. The purge had begun. But Malik knew that his battle was far from over. Removing toxic leaders was only one part of the equation. What mattered more was filling the vacuum with the right people, leaders who understood his vision, who would rebuild trust, and who would foster a culture of respect and innovation, not fear. Over the next month, Sarah worked closely with Malik to vet new candidates for leadership roles. They prioritized internal hires, promoting people from lower levels who had consistently demonstrated integrity, empathy, and a commitment to the company's core values. Malik wanted leaders who knew what it was like on the ground floor, who had worked their way up, and who understood the importance of a healthy, empowered workforce. They also introduced new policies that aimed to make TechGrid's culture more transparent and collaborative. Malik instituted open office hours, where any employee, regardless of rank, could meet with him or Sarah directly. He wanted people to know that their voices were being heard, that this wasn't just a surface-level change, but a deep transformation that would endure. As the weeks went by, the atmosphere at TechGrid began to shift. Employees who had once felt silence started speaking up, not just about problems but about solutions. Malik began to see the spark of innovation returning, the creative energy that had once defined TechGrid's rise. The purge had been painful, but it had also created space for new growth, for new ideas to take root. One evening, Malik found himself in the break room, long after most of the office had cleared out. He stood by the window, looking out over the city as the lights flickered on below. For the first time in months, he felt a strange sense of calm. The battle wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, both within the company and in the competitive landscape beyond. But Malik knew that TechGrid was on the right path. Sarah entered the break room quietly, joining him at the window. "You did it," she said softly. Malik shook his head. "We did it, and we're not done yet." Sarah smiled. "No, we're not. but we're moving in the right direction." As they stood there, side by side, watching the city hum with life beneath them, Malik knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for TechGrid, a chapter he was determined to write with care, vision, and above all, integrity. The unseen battleground. The corridors of TechGrid buzzed with renewed energy. Gone were the hushed tones of fear, the whispers of discontent. Instead, a palpable sense of optimism had begun to settle in. But Malik knew better than to be lulled into complacency. Beneath the surface of this revitalization lay an undercurrent of disquiet, a web of unseen forces plotting against him and the future he was trying to build. While Sarah was busy restructuring HR and stabilizing internal morale, Malik turned his focus outward, toward the board of directors. If there was any real threat to his reforms, it would come from there. The board was populated with individuals who had deep ties to the old guard, people who had grown fat and comfortable off the inefficiencies and nepotism that had flourished under the old system. They weren't just stakeholders, they were gatekeepers, and Malik knew that some of them were quietly assessing whether his overhaul was truly in their best interest. It was time to face the board. And this time, Malik had no intention of playing nice. The boardroom, perched high on the top floor of TechGrid's headquarters, was an imposing space. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, as if to remind everyone inside that they were a part of something larger, something that couldn't be easily contained. Malik walked into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He had worn no suit today, just a simple black shirt and slacks, a deliberate signal that he wasn't here to play by anyone else's rules. The board members sat in their usual places, a mix of seasoned investors, corporate elites, and a couple of tech-savvy entrepreneurs who had joined in recent years. At the head of the table was Harold Thorne, a silver-haired man with sharp blue eyes and the air of someone used to getting his way. Thorne had been on the board since TechGrid's early days, and Malik knew he was one of the most vocal critics of the changes Malik had introduced. "Malik," Thorne greeted, his voice smooth but lined with condescension. "I trust you've been keeping busy with your internal adjustments." Malik took his seat, but did not respond to the veiled jab. Instead, he placed a small folder on the table, deliberately slow, drawing everyone's attention to it. "Let's get to the point," Malik said, locking eyes with Thorne. "You've called this meeting because some of you are concerned. You're worried that the changes I'm implementing are too fast, too disruptive, or that they're going to affect your bottom line." His voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "So let's clear the air." Thorne leaned back, steepling his fingers as if he were entertaining a child. "It's not just speed we're concerned about, Malik. It's direction. Your reforms, while perhaps well-intentioned, are creating uncertainty. And investors don't like uncertainty." "I'm aware," Malik said coolly, "which is why I'm here to make things crystal clear." He opened the folder and slid several documents across the table. "These are reports from independent analysts. They outline the financial impacts of toxic leadership, bullying, and high turnover, costs this company has been bleeding for years. We've lost some of our best talent because of the environment that was allowed to fester. And that's before we factor in lawsuits, reputational damage, and lost productivity." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "Now my changes, yes, they're disruptive. Yes, they're fast. But what they're doing is cutting out the rot. And the numbers don't lie." He pointed to the documents. "Employee engagement is already up. We're retaining top talent who would have otherwise walked out the door. And innovation, it's surging. We've had more patent applications in the last 2 months than in the previous 2 years." One of the younger board members, a woman named Jenna who had joined during TechGrid's expansion into AI, leaned forward. "I've seen the reports as well," she said, her tone thoughtful. "And I have to admit, there's a clear correlation between the leadership changes and increased productivity. But," she added, "there's still the question of stability. How do we know these gains will last?" Malik nodded, appreciating her directness. "That's a fair question, Jenna. Stability comes from the systems we're putting in place: transparency, accountability, and a leadership pipeline that rewards integrity, not politics. We're not just cutting dead weight, we're building something new. And if we cling to the way things were, TechGrid will continue its slow death. We won't just be competing for talent, we'll be competing for survival. Thorne's face remained impassive, but Malik could sense the tension building. Harold Thorne wasn't just worried about change, he was worried about his own diminishing influence. The old guard, after all, thrived on their networks, their control of the unseen levers of power. Malik was threatening all of that, and they didn't like it. "This all sounds very compelling," Thorne said finally, his voice dripping with skepticism. "But let's be realistic, Malik. These are projections, not guarantees. And this company's growth is built on more than just happy employees. We need results, tangible results." Malik met his gaze without flinching. "You want tangible results? Fine." He pulled out another sheet from his folder, this one a projection of TechGrid's market share and customer acquisition trends since the implementation of his changes. "Our customer base has grown by 8% in the last quarter alone. We've signed 3 new major clients, all of whom were impressed by our commitment to innovation and ethical practices. That's real. That's tangible." He let the numbers speak for themselves, watching as the board members exchanged glances, some nodding slightly. Jenna, in particular, seemed impressed, and even a couple of the older members looked like they were reconsidering their positions. But Thorne wasn't ready to back down. "Not yet. Let's assume your projections hold," he said slowly. "Even if we see this growth continue, there's still the issue of governance. You're consolidating a lot of power, Malik. Decisions that used to involve the board are now being made unilaterally. That's a dangerous precedent." Malik smiled slightly, but it wasn't a warm smile. "You're right, Harold. I am consolidating power, because for too long, this company's leadership has been scattered, pulled in different directions by competing interests. If TechGrid is going to survive the next decade, it needs decisive leadership, not a room full of people protecting their own stakes." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Malik. You might find yourself without allies if you push too hard." "I'm not interested in allies," Malik said, his voice suddenly hard. "I'm interested in this company's future, and if anyone here isn't on board with that, they can leave." The room fell into a tense silence. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The weight of Malik's words hung in the air like a challenge. Thorne held Malik's gaze, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He could sense the tide turning against him. Jenna broke the silence. "I support Malik's direction," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "We need this kind of leadership if we're going to stay competitive. We've seen what happens when companies stagnate. I'm not willing to let that happen to TechGrid." Several other board members murmured their agreement. Malik saw it then, the shift, the moment when the majority of the board realized that Malik wasn't just blustering. He had the numbers, the vision, and the momentum. Harold Thorne, once the unchallenged power behind the scenes, was losing his grip. Thorne stood slowly, pushing his chair back with a quiet scrape. "I see where this is going," he said coldly. "But mark my words, Malik, you're betting everything on a gamble. If this goes south, don't expect me to clean up the mess." Without another word, Thorne walked out of the boardroom, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. As the door closed behind him, Malik exhaled slowly. He had won this battle, but he knew it was far from over. Thorne wouldn't go down easily. He still had influence, and he would find ways to undermine Malik's reforms from the shadows if he could. But for now, Malik had the board's support, and with that, he had the mandate he needed to continue transforming TechGrid from the inside out. As the other board members filed out, Jenna paused by the door. "You handled that well," she said, her voice low. "But be careful. Thorne doesn't like losing." Malik gave her a slight nod. "I know. But I didn't come here to make friends, Chinna. I came here to make this company better. And that's what I'm going to do. She smiled, a hint of admiration in her eyes. I believe you will. As Jenna left, Malik stood alone in the boardroom, looking out over the sprawling city once again. The view was the same, but something had shifted. The unseen battleground that had existed within the walls of TechGrid was now out in the open. Malik had drawn his line in the sand. The old guard was on notice. But deep down, Malik knew that the real war was just beginning. The gathering storm. The tension in the aftermath of the board meeting felt almost tangible, like the stillness in the air before a thunderstorm. Malik stood by the window in his office, looking down at the sprawling city that stretched out beneath TechGrid's imposing headquarters. The view, once a symbol of the power he wielded, now felt like a reminder of the weight he carried. The battle with Thorn had been won for now, but Malik knew that true change was never as simple as winning a boardroom skirmish. The real fight was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. As he turned away from the window, Malik's phone buzzed on his desk. It was a message from Sarah. You should see this. Urgent. Attached was a link to an article. Malik's stomach dropped as he clicked on it. The headline blared in bold, accusing letters. Whistleblower exposes toxic culture inside TechGrid. New CEO's methods under fire. Malik scrolled through the article quickly, his pulse racing. It was a hit piece, clearly designed to undermine everything he had been working for. Anonymous sources, likely disgruntled former employees or board members loyal to Thorn, had painted a picture of Malik's leadership as dictatorial, his reforms as reckless, and his vision for the company as a personal power grab. The article accused him of purging anyone who opposed him, of fostering a culture of fear, and of destabilizing the company. It was a carefully orchestrated smear campaign. The timing was no coincidence. Thorn must have been behind this. Unable to defeat Malik in the boardroom, he was now waging a public relations war. And Malik knew that in the court of public opinion, perception often mattered more than reality. Sarah burst into the office, her face a mask of frustration and concern. I've already had 3 calls from reporters, she said, her voice tight. This is spreading like wildfire. Malik rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache. It's Thorn. He couldn't win the board over, so now he's trying to poison the well. Sarah nodded. I figured as much. But we need to get ahead of this, Malik. If we don't control the narrative, this could spiral out of control. Get ahead of it how? Malik asked, though he already knew the answer. In today's hyper-connected world, it wasn't enough to just ignore these kinds of attacks. They had to be countered, and quickly. I've already drafted a response, Sarah said, handing him a tablet. We need to frame this as an attack from the old guard. Emphasize the reforms we've made, the results we're seeing, and position this as an attempt to resist necessary change. Malik read over the draft, his mind racing. The response was good, direct, but not overly defensive. It framed him as a reformer fighting against entrenched interests, someone willing to take the hard road for the sake of the company's future. It was the right approach, but Malik still felt the gnawing sense that this was only the beginning. Thorn wouldn't stop here. He was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something that could undermine Malik's entire leadership if he wasn't careful. Send it out, Malik said, handing the tablet back to Sarah. And start setting up interviews with any major outlets that are willing to hear our side of the story. We need to control this narrative before it spirals. Sarah nodded and quickly left the room, leaving Malik alone with his thoughts once again. The hours that followed were a blur of phone calls, emails, and damage control. Sarah worked tirelessly with the PR team, crafting statements and setting up media appearances. Malik himself appeared on several prominent news programs, defending his leadership and emphasizing the positive changes that had come out of his reforms. He was calm and composed in front of the cameras, but behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Every interview was a tightrope walk. One misstep, one poorly chosen word, and the whole thing could come crashing down. By the end of the day, Malik was exhausted. He sat in his office, staring at the screens in front of him. News outlets were still dissecting the hit piece, speculating about the toxic culture inside TechGrid. Some commentators sided with Malik, praising his vision and willingness to tackle tough issues. Others took Thorne's side, painting Malik as a ruthless, power-hungry CEO. As Malik leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Jenna, one of the younger board members who had supported him during the meeting. "We need to talk. There's something you need to know." Malik frowned, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. He quickly responded, setting up a time to meet with her. Something about the tone of her message felt off. Urgent, but not in a way that suggested it was just more fallout from the PR battle. Jenna arrived at his office the next morning, her expression serious. She wasted no time with pleasantries, taking a seat across from Malik and leaning forward. "There's more to this than just a smear campaign," she said, her voice low. "Thorne's been meeting with some of the other board members behind the scenes. He's planning something big. I think he's trying to orchestrate a coup." Malik's eyes narrowed. "A coup? He doesn't have the numbers." Jenna shook her head. "Not yet, but he's working on it. He's already secured a few key allies, people who are worried about the negative press and the instability it's causing. If this continues, he could sway enough of the board to force a vote of no confidence." Malik's jaw tightened. A vote of no confidence. It was the nuclear option in corporate governance, a way to remove a CEO if the board believed they were leading the company down the wrong path. Malik had never imagined it would come to this, but now the possibility seemed all too real. "What's his play?" Malik asked. "He can't just claim I'm incompetent. The numbers are on our side." Jenna hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were truly alone. "He's digging into your past. Personal stuff. Anything he can find to discredit you, to make it look like you're not fit to lead. He's been hiring private investigators, Malik. He's playing dirty." Malik felt a cold wave of anger wash over him. This wasn't just a battle over TechGrid anymore. Thorne was going after him personally, trying to tear down everything he had built. Malik knew he had to move fast. He couldn't wait for Thorne to make his next move. "What do you suggest?" Malik asked, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "We need to go on the offensive," Jenna said. "Expose Thorne for what he is. He's been pulling strings behind the scenes for years, using his influence to steer the company in ways that benefit him personally. There's a lot of dirt on him, but people have been too scared to dig it up. If we can bring that to light, it'll turn the tide." Malik considered this for a moment. It was risky, but at this point, playing it safe wasn't an option. If Thorne was willing to drag Malik through the mud, then Malik would have to fight back just as hard. "Do it," Malik said finally. "Find everything you can on Thorne, and make sure it's airtight. I don't want to leave him any room to wriggle out of this." Jenna nodded, a look of determination on her face. "I'll get on it." As she left the office, Malik sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had known from the start that changing TechGrid wouldn't be easy, but this was more than just a fight for the company. This was a battle for survival, his survival, and Malik had no intention of losing. Shadow Games. The night fell heavy over the city, its streets bathed in the cold, artificial glow of streetlights and flickering neon signs. Malik stood alone on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, looking out over the skyline. The events of the past few days weighed on him like never before. Thorne had escalated the conflict beyond anything Malik had imagined. What had started as a struggle for TechGrid's future had now become a deeply personal war. As he took a deep breath of the crisp night air, Malik's thoughts turned back to Jenna's warning. A coup. Private investigators. Thorne was playing shadow games, operating in the dark corners of the corporate world, where truth and reputation were as fragile as they were powerful. Malik knew this game, but he had always avoided it, until now. He had no choice. Thorne had gone too far. Inside, The faint buzz of Malik's phone on the kitchen counter broke the silence. It was Sarah. "It's happening faster than we thought," she said, her voice tense. "Thorne's gathering support. We're getting rumors that a vote could be called as early as next week. He's putting pressure on the board." Malik clenched his jaw. Next week. That didn't give them much time. "Have you heard from Jenna?" he asked. "Yeah, I was just about to call you about that. She found something. Something big. She wouldn't tell me over the phone, but she wants to meet tomorrow morning. Says it's enough to blow Thorne's plans out of the water." Malik exhaled, feeling a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. This could be it. The ace in the hole that could finally put an end to Thorne's relentless campaign against him. "Good. Set it up. And make sure we're ready to move as soon as we have the details," Malik said. "This ends now." The following morning, Malik arrived at a small private coffee house, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was a favorite meeting spot for discreet discussions, far from the watchful eyes of the media or corporate spies. Malik spotted Jenna sitting at a back table, her face partially hidden behind dark sunglasses. She looked tense, her fingers tapping nervously on the table's edge. He approached, taking the seat across from her. Without a word, she slid a folder across the table, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of surveillance. "This is it?" Malik asked quietly, opening the folder and skimming through the contents. Jenna nodded. "I got it through some contacts in Thorne's old circles. He's been covering this up for years, but I managed to get my hands on the records. It's not just about corporate malfeasance. It's personal, Malik. He's been siphoning money from TechGrid into offshore accounts, paying off regulators, and using his position to manipulate stock prices for his own gain." Malik's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents. It was all there. Wire transfers, hidden accounts, falsified reports. The evidence was overwhelming. Thorne wasn't just a manipulator. He was a criminal. If this came to light, his entire career would be destroyed. "Why didn't anyone ever find this before?" Malik asked, incredulous. Jenna leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Thorne's had people in his pocket for years. Investigators, auditors, even some high-level government officials. He's been untouchable because he made sure no one ever got too close." Malik closed the folder, feeling the cold sense of vindication wash over him. But not anymore. "No," Jenna said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Not anymore. This is enough to get him out of the company for good, and to put him behind bars if we play it right." Malik nodded, his mind already racing ahead. They had the ammunition they needed. Now it was a matter of timing, strategy, and precision. Thorne wouldn't see it coming, not until it was too late. The next few days were a blur of secret meetings, late-night phone calls, and careful planning. Malik's legal team worked around the clock to prepare the case, ensuring that every detail of the evidence was airtight. Sarah, ever the strategist, worked to shore up support within the board, quietly securing the loyalty of key members who had grown weary of Thorne's power plays. Thorne, oblivious to the trap being set for him, continued his campaign of pressure and manipulation, pushing the board toward a vote of no confidence. His allies were already whispering in corners, gouging support, spreading rumors about Malik's supposed incompetence. But Malik remained calm, biding his time. He knew that the key to victory wasn't just in presenting the evidence, it was in doing it at the perfect moment, when Thorne least expected it. That moment came on a rainy Thursday morning, the day of the board meeting. The boardroom was filled with tension, the air heavy with unspoken conflict. Thorne sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his smug expression betraying his confidence. He had the numbers, or so he believed. The vote of no confidence was already being whispered among his allies. Malik, seated across from him, remained silent as the meeting began. The usual corporate formalities were observed, updates on quarterly reports, discussions of market trends, but it was all prelude to the main event. Malik could see Thorne's supporters shifting in their seats, eager to get to the vote that would supposedly end his leadership. But Malik had other plans. As the discussion wound down, Malik cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. "I'd like to address the board directly," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Before we proceed with any further votes, I believe there's some information that needs to be brought to light." Thorne's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Malik stood, holding up the folder that Jenna had given him. "Over the past few weeks, I've come into possession of certain documents that reveal a series of deeply troubling actions taken by a member of this board. Actions that go beyond corporate governance and into the realm of criminal activity." He opened the folder, distributing copies to each board member. "This evidence shows clear proof of embezzlement, stock manipulation, and illegal dealings by none other than Lawrence Thorne." The room erupted into shocked murmurs as the board members leafed through the damning documents. Thorne's face turned ashen, his confident smirk replaced by a look of disbelief. "This is absurd," Thorne spat, standing from his chair. "You're making baseless accusations." "The evidence speaks for itself," Malik interrupted, his voice steely. "Bank records, falsified documents, offshore accounts. All tied to you, Thorne." The murmurs grew louder, and Malik could see several board members looking at Thorne with a mixture of anger and disbelief. His allies, the ones who had been so eager to push for a vote of no confidence, suddenly seemed less certain of their position. Given the gravity of these revelations, Malik continued, "I move for an immediate suspension of Mr. Thorne from his duties, pending a full investigation. In the meantime, I suggest we reconsider who is truly unfit to lead this company." A heavy silence fell over the room. For the first time, Thorne had no response. He was trapped, caught in the very shadow games he had perfected for so long. The board members exchanged glances, and one by one, they began to nod. It was over. Later that evening, Malik stood once again on his balcony, the city's lights stretching out before him like a sea of possibilities. Thorne was finished. The board had unanimously voted to suspend him, and the investigation was already underway. TechGrid was his now, truly his, free from the toxic grip of Thorne's influence. But Malik knew the battle was far from over. TechGrid was a ship that had sailed through turbulent waters for too long, and there was still much work to be done to steer it back on course. Yet for the first time in weeks, Malik felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the rain began to fall softly around him, Malik smiled. He had won the battle in the shadows, but the real challenge, the rebuilding of TechGrid, lay ahead, and he was ready for it.